Okay, it's 1 o'clock here, so let's get started. Hello, welcome. This is the session on Federated Credential Management API, previously known as WebID. I'm Dan. We should hopefully have some time at the end for questions here. So we've done a few of these talks, previous BlinkOns, TPAC, a lightning talk earlier in the conference. Some of these things may be repeated, but in general, I'm hoping to cover why are we working on federated identity, when it will become a problem for users, what we're planning on doing about it, how exactly we're planning on doing it. This will be a bit of a whirlwind tour. There's lots of other possible things we could fix, lots of ways we could fix them. We're trying to focus down on something we think we can ship that has a concrete issue associated with it. So we start with why. Why are we here talking about Federated Credential Management API? Why are we talking about a federated identity in the browser at all? Doesn't this work already? I can sign into things. Seems like a solved problem, no? So FedCM falls under the umbrella of the larger Privacy Sandbox initiative. One of the questions for Privacy Sandbox is, how do we introduce privacy-preserving technologies into the browser that will allow us to phase out tools and techniques in the web platform that are used for covert tracking? One of those tools is cookies passed in a third-party context. If we turn off third-party cookies, how do we continue providing federated identity? Maybe nothing breaks, maybe everything breaks. So wait, slow down. What is federated identity? What are we talking about here? Federated identity is the ability as a user to ask an identity provider, say Facebook, to authenticate you and then let a website, say Medium, know who you are. It removes the need for per site usernames and passwords. And basically, you have one set of credentials for the identity provider, or IDP, that can be used to log into many websites or relying parties or RPs. I will use the names interchangeably through this talk. This removing of per site usernames and passwords, in our opinion, makes the web safer from a phishing and password reuse perspective. And cookies are involved? Well, maybe, sort of. It depends. There's many ways an IDP can implement their login and logout flows. Some specific instances of those use third-party cookies. One example would be like the One Tap widget from Google uses third-party cookies as part of its login flow. Other logins can use a thing called link decoration. That is out of scope for the FedCM API, although it may be something we want to look into the future. And the reason we might want to look into the future is because it can also be used to track users. So differentiating between legitimate tracking and federated login tracking is the sort of name of the game here. So for example, an IDP uses an iframe to present login fields. The iframe expects to send the IDP's cookies when it is being submitted. Those cookies are considered third party because the relying party is the first party, and that would stop working under third-party cookie deprecation. The other side of the coin is what's called front channel logout. So in this case, you've signed into several enterprise applications, one of them being my support app. The user navigates to their IDP, say google.com, and you want to log out from your enterprise support apps. When you do that, it loads up an iframe for each of the relying parties, such as my support app. That iframe loads the logout URL, sends your cookies along, and logs you out of the relying party. It also uses HTTP headers to clear the RP cookies and JS to clear local storage. And that all actually logs you out. Those are all third-party cookies. And so with the third-party deprecation, those will all fail to get sent. Okay, cookies make this work. Why disable them? So as you may or may not know, cookies also can facilitate cross-site tracking. So in this example, you visit rings.com, it loads up an iframe that sets a cookie, that passes a cookie to the tracking website. You load up, engagementshoes.com, and it passes that cookie. So when you eventually go to a trips.com site, that cookie can be used to determine other sites you've been on and sort of follow you around the internet. We can't tell the difference between a federated identity cookie and tracking cookies. If we can't tell the difference, it becomes very hard to stop that sort of covert tracking. Okay, so back to our why. We want to preserve and elevate federated identity for a more private web. We want to provide primitives that will enable federated identity use cases, which currently rely on third-party cookies to continue to function without third-party cookies. Okay, so when? What's our timeline are we talking about here? When does this need to be done? What's our hard deadline? So we've been at this for a while. There's been a lot of investigation, prototyping, and analysis of other possible solutions. We've looked at things that are more restrictive, like a delegation model, things that are less restrictive, like a permission model. Each of those models has pros and cons. Some of them are more privacy preserving. Some of them are harder to adopt. So we sort of went the middle of the road for now, which is what we've called our mediation solution. Our current timeline is dictated by the Privacy Sandbox timeline, which has a target of 2023 to turn off third-party cookies. So we need to be done FedCM before that to give people time to transition. We're currently in the process of working through some dev trials. We have plans for more dev trials. Our hope is to get into origin trials early next year. Hopefully in all of that, we don't have to follow this winding line too much, going back and forth through time. Our plan for the spec specifically is to submit it to the FedID CG sooner rather than later. Our hope is that that will provide more feedback from IDPs and RPs and possibly more browser feedback. The FedID CG is the future resting home for our specification. So we've got until 2023 before things turn off. We know some federated identity flows will break. We know some federated identity flows will continue to work. So what are we building? What am I talking about here? We're proposing to have the browser mediate the communication between IDPs and websites for cases where third-party cookies are currently being used. The browser would confirm with the user before allowing the RPs and IDPs to exchange information. The browser would provide APIs to retrieve tokens from the IDP for the RP website. Logit will then happen through a same mediated interface through the browser. So we're effectively stopping the communication between RPs and IDPs. So as an example here, this is using the one tap widget from Google. As you can guess from the name, it requires one tap to sign in with. In this case, if you went to say it's not actually playing. If you go to a website, it would show, and you tap on something, the one tap widget pops up. It would show, do you want to continue as username? You can click on the username and then it would log you into the website automatically. Sadly, my auto-playing GIF does not autoplay. So what does this mean from a network perspective? Assuming the user has multiple accounts with their IDP. So you have multiple Google accounts or multiple Facebook accounts, and you visit an RP and want to sign in. You'll notice that in this, all the communication between the RP and the IDPs all happens through the user agent or the browser. There's no direct communication between the two. So FedCM will attempt to load previously stored credentials. So if you were already signed into the RP with the IDP, you should have previously stored credentials. It will tend to load those. If you don't have them, then it will fetch what is called a well-known FedCM file from the IDP. That well-known FedCM file tells us the IDP endpoints for things like the accounts, client ID metadata, which is information about the RP, the revocation endpoint, which is an endpoint to allow users to revoke tokens with the RP, and an ID token endpoint, which allows you to retrieve tokens with the RP. So once we get that well-known file, we can query the account endpoint, and it will come back from the IDP and say, here's the list of accounts you have. If there is only one account, we can skip steps 11 through 12 because we just select the only one provided. If you have multiple accounts, we pop up a window to the user and say, hey, select which account you want to sign in as. And then we query the IDP and say, okay, for this RP, give me the terms of service and privacy policy. And then we can pop up a window to the user and say, do you agree to this terms of service, and sign the user into the RP. And then we resolve the province, and the RP receives a credential for that user. Okay, so we know third-party cookie deprecation is why we're doing this. We know when it needs to be done, which is 2023. We've seen mocks that we're building. So how does it all work? Well, that's one of the things we're gathering. We're creating a use case library in conjunction with the FedID CG. This is not all these cases are third-party cookie related, but third-party cookie cases are what we're currently focusing on. But having this cases for other instances for like link decoration and stuff gives us information for the future, which is also useful. And it's also a good overview of how these federated use cases work in general. We plan on pushing more of our use cases up to the FedID CG to get more discussion. And we're hoping other identity providers, browsers, RPs contribute to their own cases to the FedID CG so that we can build out this library of use cases for federated identity. In conjunction with that, we're creating a spec. We've called it the Federated Credential Management API. It was previously called the WebID API, but was renamed recently. This is being built on top of the Credential Management Level 1 API. So Credential Management provides a lot of the credential foundations. We are realigning the Fed CM spec to be on top of Credential Management. We're doing that work now. So the API is sort of in review for that. The API is currently at the WICG. As I mentioned before, we're going to bring it to the FedID CG, which will be the hopefully future home if they accept the spec. We're working on updating the spec to closer match credential managements now. It was built on an older idea we had that was similar to credential managements, but not quite the same. In general, we're proposing a fairly high-level API. Our goal is to hopefully not require unrestricted access to third-party cookies in order to facilitate federated identity. We don't know if this is possible. We don't know if there are things that are just not mediatable, or the UI would be so terrible nobody would ever use them. That's sort of what we're exploring at this point, is all of these things around federated identity. What does it mean to ask for them and display to the user and get confirmation and understanding? And how do we do all this without getting in the way of innovation? IDPs want to add their own flavor on top of things. RPs want their own flavor on top of things. How do we not break all of that innovation in the process? And can we? The API in general is broken into a couple parts. There's stuff the relying party may need to do, stuff the user agent provides, and stuff the identity provider provides. As you can see, we think the majority of the work here is on the identity provider and the UA. The only thing the relying party has to provide is a logout API, and they only need to do that if they want to do front channel logout, which is typically an enterprise case. You don't see it in consumer cases that often. Where front channel logout is where you can go to your IDP and have them log you out of the relying parties. The IDP exposes what I mentioned before, which was that well-known file. There is an accounts API file, a metadata endpoint, a token endpoint, and a revocation endpoint. And that's sort of our API into the identity provider. The user agent provides JavaScript for the RPs to sign in, which will be in the future navigator credentials get, sign out through the prevent silent access, and a revoke method that we're adding. And for the identity providers, we're adding what I'm calling IDP logout. We don't have a great name for it at this point, but it's a call the identity provider can make so that we can tell the relying parties to log out. This is what I was saying. Our general view is there's billions of users, millions of relying parties, and tens or hundreds of IDPs. So it's easier to change something on the IDP versus the RP versus the users. So our hope and our plan is that if the RP is using JavaScript provided by the IDP that supports FedCM, we believe no changes would have to be made on the RP side, unless they want front channel logout, and then they may have to do changes because front channel logout is a more complicated example. The other part of this is session management. This is still much more of a work in progress. The other part, which we call account management, is a lot more stable. Session management includes IDP logout, but there are big open questions we have right now, like how do we do token renewal, or what about authorization? So if the RP needs to say, I want to access the user's calendar, how do we A, ask for that from the IDP, and B, ask for that from the user in a way that the user understands? So we're still exploring sort of that territory to understand this more. If you're curious, we have code behind a WebID flag probably that will change to a FedCM flag in the near future. That flag is also slightly larger than what I'm talking about here because it includes some previous interception code that we will be splitting out into its own flag in the near future as well. These dialogues only currently are implemented on mobile, so they won't show up on desktop. And the implementation is lagging the spec in that it is not updated to Credential Management API yet. It is still the slightly older design. So TLDR, third-party cookies being deprecated sometime in 2023, we think. We think browser mediation will allow us to keep federated identity working. We're not saying this is the best solution. We're not saying it's the only solution. We're saying this is the solution we want to get in place now to keep the world from breaking. We can build other better solutions later when we have slightly more time. We have a spec. It's the Federated Credential Management API spec. We're collecting use cases at the FedID CG, and there is a flag where you can turn these things on to try them. Questions? That is all I have.
I have a question. You said just now that the thing you're building might not be ideal, and that you're kind of cutting corners a little bit in order to make the deadline. What is it? The UX for the user that's working?
Let me clarify. We're not cutting corners. We're making an API that we think is a good API, but that API may not provide all the features and capabilities and bells and whistles that like an IDP wants, right? So it may not let you fully customize the UI provided to the user. It will be a much more controlled UI. The problem with that is that the IDPs want to be able to change that API in the future, or that UI in the future, right? So if we can give them a browser UI that we know will work now, that will get us past cookie deprecation, and then we can provide a thing in the future that lets them customize it all they want. That's what I mean. Does that make sense?
I see. So like, for example, the Google SSO thing that you can see that is that nice looking iframe that appears in the top right of sites might not be as smooth of an elegant of an experience for a while because you need to have a pop-up window that's mediated by the browser. I see.
Exactly. And so we want to make sure we don't break things before we make things work really, really well. So our first step is to not break the world.
I see. Are you exploring a isolated fence framey thing?
Yes, we've looked into it. Our plan is to look into it more, I think Q1, Q2, sometime next year.
Okay.
Just as we want to try and get this base stuff working well first and get it into origin trial to get the origin trial feedback. And then we can start exploring the more future looking stuff like fenced frames or other.
Okay, so is it correct to say that it's mostly that the limitations of the current plan are probably mostly going to be look and feel and look and feel in order to avoid like privacy issues. It's not anything to do with like the power of the federated back and forth API thing for certain use cases.
That's sort of an open question, right? Because for the session management use cases of tokens, we're trying to still understand all of the ways people used tokens, right? And so if you need the token but not the cookie, that's fine. We can provide you with a token. If you need the token and the cookie, that may be a separate issue, right? Because we want the API to not need you to access the cookies. And so there's this tension of, do we build a high-level API that we hide the cookies from you, or a low-level API where you do something and it unlocks cookies in some way? We're trying to aim for the high level, but it's still, we haven't heard from anybody that it won't work, but that doesn't mean that we haven't heard from the right people.
Yeah, okay. I guess I'll ask another question since, I mean, if anyone else has a question, please jump in and tell me to go away, but I'll just keep asking other questions in the meantime, if you don't mind. Another question is, when it's finished, what information does the RP get? Does it get like your name?
So we've currently I believe the credential management spec has the name, and they would get an account identifier, which depending on your IDP could be your email address, it could be an opaque thing, it could be something else, right? So whatever that account identifier is and the name is what is in the spec.
And the identifier would be considered PII.
It possibly could. Like if your identifier is your email address, then it is your PII.
Sure.
My PII.
Is there like a mode you're going to plan for to do some sort of shielding?
So that's one of the other ones we looked at called, I believe it's called delegation, which is that the browser would return you something. That's a much harder thing to tackle, right? And requires a lot more changes on the IDP side and possibly changes in other places. And so given timelines, we don't think it's feasible to get it done by that 2023 sort of deadline. It is something we are definitely interested in, but it is a lot more complicated and requires a lot more infrastructure.
Yeah, I suppose that the UA would need to maintain an anonymizing database thing somewhere. Right. But or you need to have the concept of a third-party login anonymizer.
Right. And then you get into questions of what happens if you forgot your password, like which anonymous identifier did I use with this website to log back into my account, right? You need to be able to look them back up again. And there's a lot of stuff around that. It seems to us that it would be very hard to do in a short timeline.
There's something between what currently is to what to delegation, which is a lot more long-term, which we've been calling directed identifiers, which deals with a different problem than delegation. It deals with a different tracking problem than delegation. Delegation tries to make the IDPs not know more than you would expect them to know. But then there's direct identifiers that allows us to not have the relay parties know more than they should know. And so directed ephemeral emails, for example, or even IDs that are sharded by relay parties so that it cannot be joined, are things that can be done in mediation. We're thinking something more or less along the lines of HTTPS everywhere, kind of like first a deployment of that scale, kind of like to transition from HTTP to HTTPS. We first had like things like mixed content warnings and so on, but at some point we flipped the bits with enable to say like, oh no, HTTPS by default, HTTP is harmful. And so much like that, I think the world today is that a lot of PII and global identifiers are passed. So, we'll keep that as is, but then incrementally we'll start warning the user, you're sharing your email address here, so that might be leaking some information this way or another. And then at some point it will transition to, direct identifiers being the default, and then along the lines of HTTPS everywhere.
Okay, so in the near term, if you're logged in, if you're using this API and you're logged into with a single IDP into 3 different sites, those sites, if they want to, can in the background share your tracking things.
Precisely.
Yes. We can't stop them from colluding in the background, passing your account identifier around.
So that's just out of scope? Is the way you're thinking about it?
We can if we enforce direct identifiers.
Right.
So because we're mediating, we have the entry point in which we can form an opinion over what's the right tracking risk here. So today global identifiers are passed around. So as they are being passed around, then we lost. It's game over. The RPs can collude. But sometime in the future, because we're intermediating, we have the ability to either warn the user or entirely prevent, depending on how strict that needs to be.
Okay, thank you. This is a great presentation. It really helped me understand the issues better. Thanks for presenting, Dan.
No problem. We can't enforce direct identifiers with the fenced frame style solution. Again, the answer is it depends. It depends how they're doing their communication, right? So if they're doing all top level navigation, We may have to do something like Sam said in the fence frame to stop them from doing that and force them to use FedCM. If we have them use FedCM inside in the fence frame, then we control the channel. Okay, cool. Thank you all for coming.